Hello, everyone. Welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics in games, how they work, and why we love them. My name is Greg. With me is Mark, as always, and today
we're going to be talking about cycles.
Woohoo! I'm super excited for this one, actually. This was one of the kind of harkens back some of our early ones where we didn't know what we were going to be talking about an hour ago, and managed to bounce ideas off each other until we came to a conclusion. So, we're going to be talking about. They kind of started off by talking about day and night. Mark's inspiration came from Stardew Valley in large part, and a few things he noticed, which are, I think, entirely unique to the podcast, actually, that we haven't talked about yet. Because we talked about time a little bit before, but this time we were thinking more specifically not just day-night, but cycles in general, particularly in open-world games or games that force you, that have some semblance of openness, but force you into a cyclical pattern of gameplay, and what might be good about that, what might be bad. But we had three examples, actually, we're going to be using, structuring around. The first one is Stardew Valley, which Mark is far more expert on than myself. The way that cyclically goes, spoilers, pretty much day and night. Xander and I played a lot of, or maybe not a lot, I don't know, we probably played like 20 plus hours at least of Metal Gear Solid 5. That has a day and night cycle as well, but has a completely different cyclical pattern to the game that is not tied to day and night. And then the last one we'll talk about is Subnautica, or maybe not last, but at least the third one is Subnautica, the game that Mark, Xander, and myself played together a couple times. We've probably logged, like 10, 15 hours on that. Yeah. And that one seems to be somewhere in between. That one has a cyclical pattern to the gameplay as well, but it is not purely tied to day and night, but it is a little bit. So we got three pretty cool examples of cyclical gameplay and decently open world games. Mark, do you want to just talk about how we got here, your initial thoughts on Stardew Valley and what kind of brought us into this mind space?
Yes, absolutely. I don't want to risk being too on point, though. So first, I have to say that I have listened to a lot of Guile's theme from Street Fighter 2, and if you haven't listened to that song lately, it's still just as good as you remember, and you need to go check it out. Okay, cool.
Thank God.
Here we go. Let's get back on topic.
Guile's?
Guile, Guile. Yes. Anyway, so, yes, I ended up here because I had an experience with Stardew Valley that I don't think I've really ever had with a game ever, actually, which is unusual because I've played a decent amount of games for a long time, and I feel like I have a lot of the same experiences. I enjoy them, but a lot of them are similar.
Right.
But so with Stardew Valley, for those of you who don't know, you have inherited a farm. You go to live on that farm, and you go to join a small community. It's like retro style. It's pretty simple in terms of its mechanics, and it's very non-linear. It's just sort of open. You can do what you want, and there's not a lot of direction given to you as a player. There's some suggestions and some hinting, but so the experience that I had, though, was like I would do things in Stardew Valley, and I would get a decent amount done in a given day. You're on a expedited normal time, so you're on a 24-hour clock, but the clock does not move at the same pace as in real life. So I would do things in a given day and get a decent amount done and go to bed and sort of reflect on what I'd gotten done that day, and I would start to feel like, I have a lot I could get done this day myself, like in real life. This character on screen, like, he went fishing, he like planted some trees and some vegetables in his garden, like he talked to a few people, he like went to the market and bought some food, and I was like, I'm playing this game where these things are happening on my screen. I'm enjoying it, and I like doing it. And I started thinking, like, man, I could go do this and accomplish this stuff in my life. And I actually started to feel like I want to go do these things. And I just never have played a game where I left feeling like, man, I'm really excited about the things that I'm going to do today that aren't this game.
Yeah, so the game pointed you more to your real life and actually improved your own productivity and like ability to engage with your life, as opposed to the opposite, which games tend to do, which is not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, by the way.
Right.
That being said, that was entirely unique when Mark told me this, and I was like, I was trying to relate and actually couldn't. If anything, the opposite has been true for me, in terms of I have found when I've I'd say it's probably a good sign that I'm a little bit too deep into a game, honestly. It's only happened a few times, but in general, and this tends to happen more for like when I played WoW for a little bit, or MMOs or role playing games. I think Mark can relate there, but that I am thinking more. Sometimes I'll be thinking about the game in my real life outside, and about the things that I will be doing later in the game, and like putting, and not just in terms of like, or like productivity, right? Like thinking of like, okay, here's what I got to do here. Here's this goal for this subset. Here's like where I'm at in this step, and here's how doing this. How should I prioritize? Like, it'd be better to be getting a better weapon at this point, so that I'll be able to run dungeons faster, or is it better to just be grinding dungeons to be trying to level, or like, you know, whatever combination of problem solving comes into advancement in big, huge, nonlinear games. But it sounds like the exact opposite happened for you in Stardew, Mark, which is I think awesome, amazing, and we haven't done a huge amount of talking about games and their impact they can have on real life, or games as a learning mechanic, or games like as used in the military or stuff like that. But I know that's a big interest of yours, Mark, and that would be interesting to talk about more in the future, because having I think at the end of the day, outside of there, I think there's an important niche for games to remove people, and media in general, to remove people from life. I think there's a probably even larger potential to engage them well, and being able to begin utilizing some of that would be really, really, really cool.
Yeah, well, I want to go back to what you said earlier about how, like, I can probably relate to you in MMOs, because I totally can. Like, I don't want people to think that I'm some special snowflake who, like, plays video games and then is, like, ready to go make a wooden table in his garage. Like, I have totally been sucked into games, and, like, most of what I talked about in high school was, like, wow. And that was, like, it. I was probably terribly annoying to the people around me because of how much I spent, you know, thinking and talking about these games. And so I've definitely had that experience, and for whatever reason, and this is part of what I've been thinking about and puzzling over, I didn't have that experience with Stardew Valley.
Yeah. So obviously, there's a question of, which isn't quite the point of today's cast, but the question of why this happened to Mark at this point in time, or why it's so uncommon. I think in terms of other people having that experience in games, that could be a whole other discussion. My hunch is that it's more to do with, I mean, what you said, Mark, earlier when we were talking, actually, but it's more to do with where you're at in your life right now than anything else, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's that is probably it's definitely a major factor. I do think that the cyclicalism that is in Stardew Valley, which is what we will be talking about today, plays a part in this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's kind of the classic, just kind of chemical reaction of you being in a certain point where this type of thing would be able to really react with you in a way. That you know, because as far as I know, this hasn't happened with any other games you've played, despite probably being at a similar point in your life now for a second. So it's like something unique to the way, something about Stardew, and I think the cycles that you've talked about and the way that's affected you has been quite a big part of it. Let's take a step back for a second and just talk about 9-day cycles in general, or just cycles in general with games.
Well, if I can take a second to talk about, like, if we're using me as a case study for a second, like, Factorio has got a day-night cycle, and I never felt this way. Like, I was able to sink, like, probably a whole day one time into Factorio. Like, I just pretty much spent the whole day playing Factorio. And I never felt this compelled sense of, like, going out and engaging with my own life. And so I don't think it's just the cyclicalness. You're right. There's something else going on here. Yeah, something unique. Well, let's see if we can't tease that out. But yeah, just a bare minimum background here as we were talking about stuff. I also just want to mostly I just want to shout out Nancy Drew Shadow at Water's Edge more than anything. As we started planning for this cast, it was going to be just about day-night, and then we kind of found this thing about cycles and gameplay cycles and how those might be disconnected from day and night, but we're just brainstorming games with day and night cycles that actually had some semblance of effect on the game. And this goes back to, this is one of the first, this is pretty early on in the Mostly Walking series that Day 9 does with two of his friends for adventure games, playing the Nancy Drew series, which is gigantic, just massive machine of games. There's like dozens of them. And they're not good, I don't think. I think I feel safe in saying they're not great. This one particularly was bizarre in the progression. Multiple times. I think we've talked about this before. Multiple times you literally have to do Sudoku, like, to get through the game. Yeah. Well,
it's game and
This,
the dumbest son.
I feel like I don't want to derail us too much with what could be a controversial statement, but I agree they're not great games, okay? But also I think that some of the badness that we experience is because it is a series of games which is not marketed toward men.
That's a good point. That's a good point. That's a
So
good point.
I don't give them entirely a pass, but I think that women would enjoy those games more than us, or at least some women would. I realize, yeah.
We should higher gender-based episode. Just piss everyone off.
That would be great. Let's do that.
No, anyway, but the one thing that it does do, which was interestingly enough, it's day and night. It does have a day and night cycle. In fact, as far as I can tell, the game that it wouldn't end, like the day wouldn't end unless you went to sleep, right?
Yeah,
Like
that's right.
It wasn't a huge time based. You lived every day. Oh, that's right. Okay, because you had like a day job, so the game only took place in the evening and night. So like there was actually no true day and night cycle. But the only way you like moved on in the story was by going to bed. So it was interesting in that you could like do and this took them a while to figure this out, that you could do everything you could do like in the day, like in terms of events, and nothing else would be available to happen. Like the game, it would just arbitrarily be locked until you went to bed until the next day, and then like new would appear for you to be able to do, or like the clue that you found would somehow be actionable.
It was like a weird way to enforce gating and like give a sense of time passing, but like there wasn't necessarily a reason that you like had to go to bed, which I think the other games we're going to talk about do a much better job of communicating like, hey, there's going to be consequences unless you start thinking about winding things down.
Well, also there was absolutely nothing in the game that gave you any sense that was true. Like there was nothing. There's no semblance of tutorial or like no semblance of like, hey, go to bed, like, hey, you've done everything you do for the day, like go to bed and wake up, see, like even in game, like I don't know, Nancy will talk to herself, like as a kind of sort of thing. She'll be like, it seems like I got everything done I could for the day, maybe I should go to bed. Like never happened.
That would have been nice.
Right, exactly. So there was a long time where they had like legitimately completed everything and played for another like hour looking through the entire. Remember the night when they're in the subway and they like are literally trying to go to every possible point in Tokyo to like see what left they can do to like make the game go forward.
Yeah, and there wasn't anything.
Yeah, exactly.
They wasted a lot of time. It is a really cool show to go watch if you haven't seen it. But
that's a fond place in Mark and I's friendship too.
Yes.
We really enjoyed watching that and laughing a lot. I recommend it highly. But yeah, so I think the interesting takeaway there is that the idea is the night and day cycle. One, there wasn't quite a day cycle, but the night and day cycle is used specifically to move things forward, specifically to gate things and to set up a semblance of kind of, because it is an open world game in that there's no like you can go pretty much anywhere you want within any amount of time.
Right.
But it wasn't in a way that was very organic to the game that forced you to go to bed, right? And it never got tired. There was never any reason to go to bed other than this kind of just time skip that you had to do. And, the game could have been almost just as effective if there was, almost any other way to gate. Like, it wasn't necessarily necessary to time or to days and nights, right? It was just a cyclical way to try to force things forward. In fact, it could have happened even without the player doing that, right? Like time could turn over naturally, and then you could do something else.
Right.
So it's an interesting starting point, I think, for the discussion of like the way that day and night, or in this case, cyclical games can be good and be bad. You want to talk about Stardew, Mark, and more what the way that Stardew limits you into the day and night cycle?
So the cycle in Stardew Valley, I already talked about the time. So like actually the time and the day-night follows what you would expect from like a game that has a 24-hour cycle inside the game.
Right.
It's realistically probably like 20 minutes for a day. But you are also... So you start every day, if you have gone to bed correctly and everything, you start the day at full energy. And as you do things throughout the day, you have an energy gauge that goes down. This is the only gauge that you have. That's the only resource that you really expend in Stardew Valley. This includes things like if you chop down a tree, you're going to lose some energy. If you eat food, you'll get energy back, right? If you sleep, you get energy back. So you could theoretically go through a day, use up your one tank of energy, not eat anything, sleep, wake up the next day, and have full energy again, which is a little bit unrealistic. But I think that it does a really good job at sort of... tapering the amount of things that you can do in a given day, because you start off with full energy. You're like ready to go. You could do anything. You chop down a bunch of trees, you plant a bunch of plants, you could, mine some rocks or dig up some holes in your yard or build things. And then your energy starts to go down and you start thinking like, okay, what do I need to make sure I do today because I'm running out of energy. I've only got like a few vegetables to eat. I don't want to like go through my entire like store of food today. So, I need to prioritize what I'm going to use my energy for. And then as maybe it gets around 8 or 9 o'clock, you're almost out of energy. You're thinking like, okay, is what's like one last thing I can do, or like, is there anything I need to like go wander around and visit, or some like story beat I want to try and hit that's like not going to require as much energy, because I don't have much left. And then you kind of go to bed at the end of the day. And so you have this like weird, I have never quite experienced this in a game, progression where you start off with a massive number of decisions to make, and then every time you make a decision you have less decisions that you could be making. And then slowly at the end of the day, like if you don't go to bed on time, the game, you'll pass out wherever you're standing, and then you'll wake up in your bed and you'll get a note about what happened to you the night before. And somebody always finds you and puts you back in your bed. Like, you don't die, but like the game will eventually eliminate all decisions from you and just say you're going to sleep now.
So we talk about either very, very kind of organic game development versus like games, like things that have to be really, really direct in the game and like show you like with arrows or like instructions or tutorials and like how to do something. And we tend to talk about things that are like systems within the game that don't do that as feeling more integrated into the game itself and tend to be, in my opinion, more desirable. But that's an incredible one of, like you said, Mark, the net effect of it being limiting and forcing you to make choices, while also being entirely true to kind of the setting of the game, of the kind of the fantasy that's being played out as this kind of very semi-realistic thing where, yeah, you can only do so many things in a day.
Right.
That's brilliant that it all comes out of a single system, which is pretty darn straightforward. It's just an energy meter. Just right. You have a limited amount of thing. If the resource in the game is like doing things as opposed to like, say like amount of structures you can build or seeds, and obviously that's another. There's other levels of that within the game of resource management. But if the core resource management is literally doing anything, which is kind of the way that like life is,
right?
doing it. That's a brilliant way to then, like you said, the cascade of systems from that, like the decision making that you have to have, follows really easily and naturally, as opposed to being like stopping you at every point during the day and being like, okay, now you feel this way. What would you like to do? Because you can only do these things. You can't do these things anymore. Like right. That's not the. But yeah, that's a really interesting mechanic that they put into the game to be able to kind of achieve that goal of like giving you a sense of limitedness, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it mirrors the experience that the player has with the energy gauge, mirrors your experience of time in real life, right? Like you're never gonna like run out of time. Like you can't spend all your time in one day, right? Like that right. Even that phrase is meaningless because time is always handed to you at a fixed rate, and like you can choose how to use that energy, but it's always doled out to you in a very regimented way. And like you'll always have more because you always wake up the next day and you'll have full energy, but right. You don't just have like an unlimited anything in terms of like how much you can do and produce and experience in a given day. And so I think that's interesting, and that sort of mirrors people's experience with their real lives. Because first of all, yeah, you're right, you do have certain amounts of energy in a day, but you also only have certain amounts of time. And I would say actually that energy gauge goes further into modulating the player's sense of time in the game than the actual day-night cycle. Because right. You just get to a sense at the end that you're like, okay, like I'm either completely out of food or like I need to save up this food because I need to sell it because I'm a farmer and that's what I do. I'm not going to have any money unless I just go to bed and get more energy that way. And so right. you just kind of, you do end your day. It's sort of natural. Even if it wasn't dark out, quote unquote, you would still do that.
Right. It's just ideal, right? It's the ideal way to work within the system. It's just a very functional choice to make, right? Just because of the way everything's built up. It's like, no, it's actually probably just better to go to sleep.
Right.
So I wonder, and we can kind of dip in and out of this as we go, but I mean, in terms of that, whatever little piece of specialness that Stardew has that made you begin interacting with your own life in a different way, that level of touching on reality seems to speak to me in terms of like that seems to be something that would Factorio doesn't have that, right? There's no level of like you said, like the interaction between even probably subconsciously, right? But the idea that they structure time and energy in such a way that is very, very similar to the way that you actually have to work in the real world.
Right.
The resources in Factorio and the way you interact with the resource management of Factorio is far, far different.
Oh yeah, it's much more
Real.
focused on like building systems and like trying to progress and do the next thing, and like there's no limit to what you can accomplish in a given day.
Right.
There's not really much different between day and night. Some enemies are a little bit different at night, but like, and you know,
Right.
if you have solar powered things, you're not going to be producing energy at night. But like the day and night is just seen as another system to interact with rather than like a governing force. Which
Yeah,
in
totally.
like Stardew Valley, your energy meter is like it's basically a force to be reckoned with. Like eventually, you're going to get tired and have to go to bed.
Right, and you talked about that too, even like with the day and night stuff, that like there was less things you could do at night anyway, in terms of like, again, just kind of with the farming mechanic or the farming idea of it, like it just makes less sense outside of the energy dynamic. That like at night there were just less things you could be doing anyway, because like I don't know, you can't sell it, like markets
Yeah.
asleep.
Yep, people are
there's-
gone.
Right. There's not like your animals are probably far less active, or it doesn't make so much sense to feed them or whatever because they're asleep too, and so on and so forth. And that's again just kind of this like, yeah, very. I just wonder if there's some like because Factorio could be like more if your work like if you're an industrial engineer and you design systems right in the way that like Factorio kind of like thinks about like automation and figuring like I could see a way in which playing Factorio could cause an industrial engineer to engage with his work more so, you know.
Right.
Like a certain part of their life, or even the stuff that you were talking about, Mark, like with the stuff that Stardew Valley made you engage with slightly more, would it be like kind of practical, like errands or things that you would like run out and do to like kind of see to a very practical level of it wasn't inspiring you to go out and like see a movie, right? Like,
No.
or,
Yeah,
like,
it was
go-
very much like taking care of things in my life and like thinking about how do I want to spend my energy to be productive today, and not productive in like trying to systematize everything in my life like Factorio, but just like what do I want to spend my energy on, right? Because like a lot of times you develop systems and you automate things so you don't have to spend energy, but Stardew Valley does not have a lot of automation in it.
Yeah, totally, and that makes so that makes all the sense in the world, right? Why that would be pushing you into that point. I mean, it's very. I mean, outside of like Amazon, I guess delivering all your food, it's very difficult to automate your like daily chore list or just like the weekly things that you have to do to like maintain like this kind of natural standard of living. You can't just set up the system and then have it repeat over and over. You have to something you have to do over and over again, which is exactly what Stardew Valley is. So
Right.
it makes sense that that would be the very natural progression from the game, and a very very thoughtful man such as yourself being affected by it in that way.
Well, this seems like a natural point to transition into talking about a game which does do like a cycle, but it does it in quite a different way. You were talking about Metal Gear Solid 5 earlier.
Correctamundo. So this one, I regret deeply saying that, by the way, immediately. But
Correctamundo.
yeah, what was I channeling there? Something not cool. Anyway, no. So MGS5 is also has a day and night cycle, but that one is the day and night portion of it is far more kind of similar to most games. Honestly, seems as we were thinking about the day and night cycle, the way it's used, it seemed to be pretty limited. Honestly, it'd be tend to be used in terms of like it would affect the things that were out in the world, right? Like at the simplest, right? Like Shadow of War or Shadow of Mordor, probably both of them have a day and night cycle, and basically the only thing that changes is like certain creatures will come out at night and certain ones won't. It's harder to find certain like certain animals, and then like there's a species of ghoul that only comes out at night, and that's like pretty much it. A few other things change, but in large part it's just that. So I think most games are kind of just that level. Like I feel like most MMOs probably treat night and day cycles that way in large part. Where it's kind of something closer to just aesthetic, and then like kind of a binary switch of like, okay, these things can happen then, and these things like Pokemon Gold and Silver when that got introduced. Not that those are like bad systems, but they're all kind of similar as we were talking about it. I think at core, Metal Gear Solid 5 is similar in terms of its day and night cycle, but that is not the core cyclical part of the gameplay, I think, in my completely uneducated opinion. Um, MGS5 does have some meaningful differences at night, particularly in terms of stealth and the way that patrols work in camps. Light definitely, it's hard to be seen at night, so that makes a difference. You have some night vision tools that your enemies might not have, and so on and so forth. And like I said, patrols and strongholds will be different. Past that, nothing in the way you shoot guns, nothing in the way that your character is able to do anything really changes. And so hence it doesn't really turn you into, in fact, it's very manipulatable. When you deploy on a mission, you just pick the time that you deploy on. So there's no huge sense of cyclicalness of like you having to measure out your days and what you do during the day and what you do during the night. It's more like picking about, hey, what state do I want to engage this mission in? Because you just get to pick it. So it's kind of just more like this flip. The way it does happen though, or the cyclicalness of the game, which I found interesting, was Mark was talking about, particularly with Stardew, and I think we can come back to this eventually, but the fact that there was some level of, at the end of the day, you can no longer do anything, right? You just have to go to sleep and recharge, and there's some level that might naturally just encourage the player to reflect a little bit on what he's done during the day, or like what, similar to real life, like what has happened. And that seemed unique. The games seem to be far more pressing forward in terms of always trying to get you to do the next thing, as opposed to having any semblance of space for you to sit and think about what you're doing in the game or what you've just done, or any kind of semblance of reflection, right? That doesn't seem to be too common. And so I was thinking about Metal Gear and the fact that I think you still do that. It just takes a very different form, and it's not necessarily at night. In this case, they actually made it so that the only way you can interact with a huge portion of the game, so you're deployed in Afghanistan, like in this open world kind of setting where it has the night and day cycle, and that's like most of the gameplay, right? Is like when you're deployed. But there's another huge other side of the game, which is kind of like base management, or like the idea is like you're kind of building a mercenary cohort from scratch, and you're trying to recruit things, and you're building on bases, and you're adding research, and you're managing personnel, and you're trying to develop new technologies, and yada, yada, yada. And the only way you can do any of that is getting into a helicopter and removing yourself via loading screen. Like the game will actually stop and you'll go to a loading screen. Then you'll reload in the helicopter, like over the ocean somewhere, just completely nondescript. And from there, you can access all of these different menus and all these different systems that are more like the base building, like management portion of the game, as well as like planning out your next sortie, like your next mission. Like when you redeploy into the world, the only way you can do that is by, like, if you complete a mission in the game world, the open world, then the only way that you can go to the next mission is by leaving, getting into your helicopter, going to the loading screen, and then redeploying to a separate place in the map, even if it's somewhere you could reach anyway, via like the mission select kind of UI. So it does become super cyclical because you get removed from doing anything actionable, basically, in the game world to pretty straight management levels, which I thought was really interesting because it does give you this sense of, it doesn't necessarily encourage you to reflect, but it does give you it does force you to stop being in the open world in a way that most night and day cycles don't do. Like think Skyrim, or kind of, again, most MMOs. In large part, you can do anything you want during night and day. There's no point where it forces you, like night doesn't force you to stop playing. And similarly, night doesn't force you to stop playing in Metal Gear, but the natural episodic format of kind of the story missions does force you, or if you want to be kind of progressing through the game, like the level up screen, you could think of it means that you have to go back home to base. So I was beginning to think of like cyclical natures in games being outside of the day and night, and more so some other system, which in this case is like forcing you, if you want to progress at all, then instead of just playing the game exactly as you are for the whole game, then you do have to step outside of the game and enter a far more kind of management-based, more kind of reflective-based, less action-based screen.
Interesting. Yeah, like, and I think it's the norm what you mentioned, that games will, have day and night, but it won't actually like prevent you from doing a lot of things, and it's just sort of, like different enemies come out at night is kind of the classic thing, but that you identified and sort of decoupled this idea of having time to reflect and to anticipate what's going to come next from a day-night cycle. And I think that that's really good, because I was sort of putting those together in my head. But
Right.
I think that that's really important, and this is a place that I want to stay for a second. Like, I think that giving the player a chance to sort of recoup from what they've done, reflect on it, think about how they want to prepare for their next adventure, and get to do that, and sort of be grateful for the experiences that they've had in the game, and look forward to, like, oh my goodness, we're gonna like go, engage this particular enemy. I think that is really important to enhancing the player's experience of the game, and it's not like the most engaging thing as a game, like as a developer,
Right.
because your whole point is to not engage the player there. Like, you want the player to engage your game. You're
Yeah.
inviting them to not just react to the world anymore, but to actually reflect on, hey, what's been happening? Like, my life in this game, how is it going? And like, what's going to happen and what has happened? And like,
Right.
I think that's a vulnerable place to put yourself as a designer, to think like, oh, the player is going to want to reflect on their experience that they're having in my game. Because if they don't like it, then there's a good chance that at that point they're going to say, hey, it's been enough of this game, I'm done. But I think if you are confident in your game and the experience you're giving your player, that letting them savor what's happening is actually really beneficial.
Totally, and I love the way you put like it's far riskier, right? I mean, think about again, just even in general, kind of culture right now, and being able to be constantly connected to darn near everything, and kind of consistent stimulation being able to be utilized. That's definitely the way the games would go, and if they can keep you on these kind of casino-esque levels where you're continually getting kind of manipulated into doing the next thing via, and not, again, this is the most negative scope of way to put all of this, but a game that was constantly, sending you on to the next thing and utilizing kind of these very simple psychological progress bars or ways to make you continually just doing, as opposed to stop and actually reflecting. You're right, it does require the quality of the game to be worth reflecting on. It's a lot easier to keep someone doing just kind of these mindless repetitive tasks over and over, to keep them playing. And you're right. I mean, in general, again, kind of going back to the thing that we always come back to, which is developers always want you playing their game. That's a far more risky, and probably counterintuitive place for a developer to build into their game a place where you're not playing it. Like,
Yeah.
you're actually given the space to reflect on the game itself. I think that's
Well,
just countercultural, as well as even within the economic model of games, super not great. But I do agree entirely in terms of, I think that's hopefully something the culture is beginning to learn, that being 100% on connected at all times is not the best, with the whole mindfulness movement kind of becoming popular. I think we're recognizing that taking time out of it does actually improve the time that you are doing things. And I totally believe that would be true for games too. The idea of being able to take you out of, force you to, again, in a multitude of different ways. We've just kind of talked about the way two games have done it. We'll talk about Subnautica for a second here too, but um, I think Subnautica of the three is probably even the least. You're still doing something in this downtime for Subnautica, basically, um, as opposed
right.
to Stardew Valley, where you're literally doing nothing, and then Metal Gear Solid, you're doing something, but it's a lot different task than the normal third person adventure game, right? So
Well,
it's kind
in our episode about loot boxes, we talked a lot about the psychology behind loot boxes and sort of operant conditioning and those sorts of things. And the antidote for operant conditioning, and when you feel like you're being sucked in by operant conditioning, and you don't actually enjoy the game, but you've been conditioned to play the game, is to take downtime. Like, that's what I would recommend to people, is like, set an alarm at that time, step away from the game, don't be in front of the screen. You can pace around your room or whatever, but just think, am I having fun in this game, or do I just feel like I need to keep playing? And
right.
so if your game is heavily reliant on operant conditioning, yeah, giving them time to reflect on the adventure that they just had or what they just accomplished is like suicide
Super.
for your game. Like, you would
Yeah,
not want to do it.
yeah.
So I
That,
think that it does demand that games be of a higher quality and don't rely so much on Skinner boxing.
Yeah, totally, and that's just, the easy way would be talking about loot boxes, in terms of, that's kind of, we did manage as an industry to somehow, like, kind of simplify down that opera conditioning game loop into the most literal sense of literally just giving, like, playing to get a box and open the box. Like, before, at least it was kind of, it was a little bit more subtle and more disguised. I think it.
Our Skinner boxes ended up being actual boxes. Yeah, that is highly
Yeah,
ironic.
kind of incredible that we literally even named them loot box, like, one step removed even phonically. Um, but uh, but anyway,
Skinner
point.
Skinner loots loot
Yeah,
Skinner.
featuring you're actually a rat. Um, you know, like, but I forgot the point I was making. Regardless, the idea of screw it. I don't know what I'm saying.
Okay. Well,
I was just laughing. I'm still thinking about the rat game, and then that made me think about have you seen the goose simulator game where you're a goose in a garden?
no. Do you get to eat breadcrumbs? Are there breadcrumbs?
Yeah, I'm sure there's breadcrumbs. Basically your job is to like frustrate the gardener.
Oh,
It's like a stealth. Like it's mostly a stealth game. It's like top down isometric.
Mm-hmm.
You control. It's very beautiful, actually. It's like indie. Anyway, sorry. That's totally off topic. Okay, let's go back to. You want to talk about Subnautica now? And
Yeah, let's do it. Let's talk about Subnautica, and then maybe we can do some synthesis at the end here.
Yep. Let's briefly recap the. So like with. And you actually did point out an interesting thing. I think I had thought with Stardew Valley, they pretty much put the night and day cycle as that cyclical thing. But technically, it's that resource management that you're talking about, energy. And the way that they do this, they just really, really closely linked the way to get more resources with the night and day cycle. So it just happens to line. Metal Gear Solid, they didn't do that in terms of they totally de-linked the 9-day cycle from the way to get more resources and to kind of establish space and to move forward and to kind of replenish a lot of your resources in terms of a different type of resource, but more kind of the forward motion of the game. I think it's a really interesting thing we could talk about more too, the idea of like decoupling character metagame, like progress, from playing the game itself. And having those two things be interconnected and cyclical and both needing to be necessary. I think it's a really cool thing that Metal Gear does. But the last one would be Subnautica, which we talked about a couple times now, and we both, I think, safe to say, enjoy very much. That does have, again, a straight day-night cycle, and has some of those kind of normal day-night things where certain creatures will come out during the night that won't be out during the day, and the psychological factor there is there too for Subnautica, right? Like that was way more in. You're not scared of the night at all in Metal Gear Solid. Similarly,
it's not really. Yeah, no, it's not like something you're frightened of in Stardew Valley. It's just more like there's not much going on. It's just sleepy.
Right, but oh my God, Subnautica! I mean, just then again, natural, just kind of a piece. Inserting the day-night cycle into deep, deep water, which is already scary, makes night deep water horrifying.
Yeah, really. And it's interesting because I think probably what we'll notice with Subnautica is that the day-night cycle matters less and less the more time that we spend in deep water because of just the way that water interacts with light. And so, like, when you're first starting the game, the day-night cycle feels like a really big deal because you're spending your time in pretty shallow water. You're very new to the ocean and the environment, so you're not really sure, like, how it changes at night. And, like, in the beginning, like, we just didn't want to be in the water at night, period. We just stayed in our pod.
That actually happened, yeah. The first 2 nights, didn't we just literally hop into the pod and wait for, like, 5 minutes?
Yeah, I think we did.
Yeah. Until morning.
And so that was like an interesting psychological cycle that happened, but there's a deeper cycle built into the game that you identified, Greg.
Right. Well, I was just thinking, again, in terms of what did the game... In terms of... That was just psychological. The game didn't actually force you back into the pod for those times, or force you to not be doing things in the same way that Metal Gear or Stardew seem to have. But the way that it does... Subnautica seems to do it was the hunger and thirst mechanics. So basically, if you think about, like... these things of like maintenance being like these forced ends of cycles where like, hey, you can do the things you meant to do and then you have to like come back and like do some maintenance work to ensure that you can keep on going back and playing the game.
Right.
If that's the way you break up the cycles with Stardew with the energy at night, Metal Gear with going back to base and being able to oversee kind of your whole operation, resupply. In Subnautica, it's literally making sure you have enough food and water. That you kind of have to stop doing the thing. We had to stop whatever our goal was during the game, whether it be that, exploring the crashed ship or trying to get more of this mineral or whatever it was to work towards this goal. We had to stop and force ourselves back into a very basic level of maintenance for our character, which most of the time was water. Food was easy to get. Water was a little bit hard to get. And the interesting thing with Subnautica was that they did actually link the way that you got resources to the day and night cycle, and that the way you got water was from a specific fish that was almost impossible to find during the day. I think we found it like once or twice, but in large part would come out in very decent numbers at night and was very easy to find at night. So it did kind of tacitly and I think quite brilliantly engage this, like, okay, nighttime can be a more maintenance-based time where we're closer to our pod. We're basically just looking for bladderfish, which are the fish that you can use to filter water. And then daytime you can be out because honestly it's hard to find things daytime. It also did force a level of planning in terms of, hey, if we're going to be running out of water during the day, we're kind of screwed. So at night it is worth it to actually stock up on bladderfish, even if we didn't need a whole lot of water. It's interesting. It's a lot more. I don't know. It's less cut and dry in my opinion than Metal Gear and Stardew. Even as I'm talking,
yeah, like you
way that the cycles through, because you can you can't like sleep for 3 days in Stardew and get like 3 days worth of energy and then do that.
Right.
You can do that in like we could spend just like hours looking for bladderfish and like maxing out all of our water, and then we could play for more hours, right?
Yeah, so absolutely. It's much more flexible. Like with Stardew, you can get food, and then that will replenish your energy. But the amount of energy you get from food, like you can burn it a lot quicker than you can get it, and so it feels like you're always fighting uphill when you're trying to get more energy out of a day. And it's much easier to just sort of go with the established rhythm of like, okay, end my day, free energy, cool. I don't have to eat all my food. Whereas with Subnautica, like, it is easier to get water. Like, I would say you don't burn water at the rate that you burn energy in Stardew Valley, because that would be super annoying. But also you can sort of cache a crap ton of water and, like, take it with you on a mission and be out there for, like, multiple days, no problem.
Right, exactly. Which is really, and so then the only thing that changes in terms of the day-night cycle is, again, that kind of psychological factor, which, again, you mentioned. I actually love the idea of, you're right, as we get deeper and deeper, darkness will probably mean less and less, but also just in general, as we survive more nights, the very natural kind of lack of fear of the unknown will begin to go away, and we will have a better grip of being able to be out at night. So that's not sustainable as a cyclical way to keep us, kind of confined at the end of the night. But the thing it does, I don't know, Subnautica just gives you a whole lot more freedom in terms of the cyclicalness. The cycles are really rigid in Stardew Valley. And a little bit less, and a little bit more rigid in Metal Gear 2 in terms of you can't do the next thing until you, like I said, you go back to base and select your next big mission. Subnautica, that's not true of any of those, basically. It's entirely how much effort you want to put into your maintenance at whatever times. So I think that's actually really cool in terms of it gives the player tons of choice. It does force, eventually, if you don't do the things you're supposed to be doing, it will force you back into those times of resource gathering, as opposed to, like, goal-oriented forward motion. But it gives you a lot of freedom in the way that you decide to do that, which is super different from even just, like I said, like psychologically, as we were talking about, like what Stardew does in terms of forcing you kind of at the same time every day to like take stock of the stuff you're doing. I think there's a lot less of that in Subnautica because it is so much more fluid.
Right.
Fluid. But it is so much. It's not regular anymore. Right? It's suddenly it's very much up to you to be doing those things. I think especially if I was playing Subnautica alone, I would be far less reflective in that space. It is a lot easier to feel kind of like the urgency of like, oh crap, I forgot about water, now I have to go get water, as opposed to like, hey, this is this cycle that I've gotten into every single day to get water because I know, like I was a little bit less planning ahead in Subnautica,
right? Yeah, I'd agree. There's a bit more reacting to your gauges. I do think there's if I were to think about it now, I think I would find myself naturally returning to the pod to gather water at night. And, like, because it's safe, and you don't have to worry about encountering any weird creatures at night, which is freaky. But also, like, it's easier to find water, it's easier to find bladderfish, and you have to do it anyway, so it's like, you might as well do it at night. And as people, I think we're used to doing more maintenance-type tasks at night, like, think about brushing your teeth. And, I don't know. I know I do a lot of, like, I take out the trash at night. I do a lot of maintenance at night. And I think some of that's natural. One thing that came into my mind that we haven't discussed yet, so get ready, is the sort of microcycling in Subnautica of oxygen.
Yeah, sure.
Like, you enter into this sort of dangerous unknown where there are creatures around and resources to be gathered for sure, but a lot more risk. And then you are forced to leave that environment and go up to the surface where you can see everything, and it's, at least during the day, it's bright, and it's actually kind of nice and kind of relaxing. Like, we haven't explored to the point where I'm afraid on the surface of getting, like, attacked by something. Generally, if you're by the surface, it feels pretty safe.
Yeah, there's nothing up there, and that's another interesting. I love that point because that makes me think of like Risk, basically. Like you're talking about with like even with Metal Gear. So Metal Gear has like very little risk associated with not going back to base. Like you can resupply, you can get ammo without going back to base. The thing about it is that you just can't really progress a whole ton. So there's not too much risk involved with Stardew Valley. Staying out until if you're trying to get every ounce of energy out that you could, and then misjudged it, and then you fall asleep. You do lose stuff when you die or when you fall asleep and have to get picked back up, right?
Yep. Yeah, you do.
That's big, huge. You only have to do that once in a while. With air, that risk assessment is like pretty consistent actually in Subnautica. I mean, again, depending on how you have. But you're always thinking about it is this kind of self-limiting little thing, as well as when you're going up towards the air, like however much time it even takes to surface again, you have nothing to do there but just sit and think about what you're about to do next, like where like we would use those times for surfacing when there's the three of us to like talk about like just what like if we should keep on doing what we were doing, like how we're going to go back, like you kind of little planning times, which I think that's a great observation. Is that maybe the same thing exists in terms of the amount of reflection, but it just got diffused and put into smaller chunks all over the game.
Yeah, and it shares that same quality of being relatively uninteresting, right? Like, it's kind of novel the first few times when you, like, come to the surface and you get some air, but, like, that wears off pretty quick, and you're just like, okay, gotta get more oxygen, we're gonna run out, we don't want to die, so we have to go back to the surface. But, like, it when you're down far, it takes a second to get to the surface, and there's not anything particularly interesting about getting air. And so you could look at that and be like, oh, that's bad game design. Like, that's uninteresting. Why are we having the players do that over and over again? But I think that actually it does provide a sense and a point of reflection, like you're saying, a time to think about, do we want to keep doing this? Is this worth the back and forth trips that we're having to do between the floor of the ocean and the surface? Because it does take a lot of work.
Right, or should we be working towards a different goal, which is trying to build, basically you can always build bigger air tanks, it seems. Right. Or get more air, or put pieces on that make your air degrade slower. So yeah, that's a great point. Is that it actually does force you to reflect more in a metagame sense too, of like what your goals are, and like, hey, do we want to keep on trying to pursue this goal in this way, which is going to potentially be really, really long, and not kind of the idea of like, hey, we could have just kept on eating the kelp or the vineweed throughout the entire game.
Oh yeah, creep vine
system. It just would have sucked, right? And it was a lot more fun to figure out a way where we didn't need to rely on this crappy system anymore. So it's this kind of always back and forth of like, hey, is this continually worth our time and effort to be utilizing this amount of air with our current, whatever the goal is at whatever depth we're going to.
Right.
That's a great example. Is that, and it's super integrated into the gameplay loop too. Like it's literally like every 2 minutes of air roughly.
Yeah, roughly with what we're at right now with oxygen. But we are pretty it's an interesting way of doing gating. Because I would say, with the amount of oxygen we have right now, we're limited to exploring. I would say past 250 feet would be pretty painful and annoying. Like, you wouldn't get to spend much time down there before you get to go back up. I
don't think we can make it down to 250 feet before suffocating, right?
We can. We were chilling down by 200 when we found that terrible creature from the Black Lagoon.
Oh my god, I forgot about that. Holy
and we had enough time to swim away from that thing, but it was terrifying.
I legitimately blocked that from my mind. God, that was the worst. We were like almost as deep as we ever been, like sub 200 feet.
Yeah, that was as deep as we'd ever been.
And the light does go away. That's the way water works. And there was this. Oh, dude, there was just the worst. It was like this oddly humanoid. Like we called it like a sea witch. It's unclear what it was. It was some outline that we made out like 20 feet away from us and made us all collectively poop our pants and run screaming.
Yeah, that was a good time. But one thing I want to say, and I think this would be my advice to people who are going to make open world games or considering making open world games, like the amount of autonomy you're going to give players should be paralleled by the amount of time you're going to give them to reflect on what they're going to do and what they're planning on pursuing.
Yeah,
because if it's a game like, let's take the first God of War game. If it's a game like that, you don't need to provide reflection because you've already provided them so much direction and so much linearity in what's happening that they don't need to reflect on what their next goal is. Their next goal has been handed to them and is always handed to them. when you're playing a game like Subnautica, where you can go anywhere and do anything in this ocean, you want to give the player more time to stop and think, like push pause on the action and think, okay, what am I doing and why am I doing it and what's my next goal?
And I love the idea too of building that into your game, as because you can do that with that necessity will be there for any game of sufficient scale and size, right? And it would just look like if you don't build that into points in your game, like you do with Stardew or Metal Gear or Subnautica, you would just have your character sitting, like you'd probably just pause the game, right, and just sit there and think for a second, or just like have your character stand still in the game world and nothing happens, right? That kind of takes you out of the experience. So it's a cool, like, I mean, yeah, say like Skyrim, for example, is a fine example of that, where it is so gigantic that you absolutely need time to be able to figure that. I guess you could say travel in Skyrim was a decent time to do that, if you don't have to travel. But even past that, in large part, you could probably spend a lot of time just sitting there thinking, like, okay, what's my next thing I'm going to do, as opposed to it being kind of organically built into the game, as we've talked about with these three systems. That forces you to do that, because each one of these games is gigantic. I mean, Metal Gear is in particular, actually, I was staggered by the scale, because I'd played Metal Gear Solid 2 way back in the day. I was like 2001, and those games, tend to be they're stealth narrative, soap opera basically, action, and the scale of MGS5 is just insane. Obviously, Stardew is similar in terms of people who were saying hundreds and hundreds of hours, and Subnautica as well. We've seen, we've probably seen, like 10% of the content in that game? I don't know. Maybe a little bit more. But barely scraping the surface with Subnautica. So when you have games of that just size, that's a good point. You do need the ability to reflect, and being able to build that into your game is like a cool thing.
I think that, like, in terms of the criteria for that, like, you basically just need something that is sort of meditative. I think it's useful when it's meaningful, that the player can do. That's, like, fairly mindless. There's not a lot of risk associated with it, but it feels like, hey, there's not a lot happening right now. It's okay for your mind to wander a bit. Like, when you're swimming to the surface, you don't have to, like, dodge, at least right now, you don't have to, like, dodge things and, like, make sure that you get to the surface okay. You pretty much just point your camera at the surface and hit swim. And then you have to do it, and it's important, like sleeping in Stardew Valley, or like upgrading your base in Metal Gear Solid. And you can, do this reflection. And I think that's a good way for people to put that element into the game, instead of just having like a, basically a mental loading screen, which is kind of what you would have if you just pause the game.
Right. So here's a question. How much time do we have?
5 minutes.
Okay. Well, this might be a cool way to end. Thought experiment, which is, would removing sleep, like, okay, so like I was thinking about like MMOs particularly, and like and Skyrim, I was talking about travel, right? Like for big open world games, a lot of time fast travel is something you have to unlock, or just modes of transportation are things that are desirable. Or people complain about World of Warcraft, where you just have to sit there on a flight path and you don't do anything, you're just sitting there. People complain about that, as opposed to what we've been talking about seems to be putting in a pretty great light. No one's like, I love being able to like just sit and not think about anything or reflect on my game as I'm traveling between these things in Azeroth. That tends to be something that is like frowned upon, actually. So, would Stardew Valley be a better game without it? Like, would you enjoy basically removing that cycle entirely and just always being able to consistently be doing exactly what you want to be doing at all times, right? I think the idea in like WoW, for example, is that you don't want to be sitting there waiting when not doing something productive when there's so many things to be doing.
So I don't think it actually would be like an improvement in the gameplay. And I think one of the reasons is that in a game like WoW, it's pretty intuitive what you want to be doing next. At least my experience with WoW was like, I kind of always knew this is like where I go next to quest, this is the next objective I want to get to, this is the next thing that I want to engage with. And so I didn't need a lot of time on a mount to like reflect about my gaming strategy or progression. It seemed pretty canned. Like I knew what I was getting, and I was enjoying myself, but I didn't need to deeply engage with the strategy and nature of the game that I was playing. Like I didn't have to ponder like what sort of, how do I craft this particular item, and where do I need to go, and what do I need to get, and all of that.
Yeah, that's interesting, because for WoW, I totally agree. That makes tons of sense, particularly in kind of like the questing stages, or even, endgame too. And certainly in terms of MMO, like we've talked about, one of the kind of the most linear, most constructed, least amount of open worldness, maybe kind of most theme parky. That WoW is very much about like wanting to do the things that you want to do, right? Like I just want to like it's not too much thinking or metagaming about what you need to do. It's far more about doing the things, right? And it's
Right.
pretty darn.
Especially in like raiding and like the end game content. Like it's very clear like what you need to do next. Or sometimes it's even just like a rep grind where it's like it's just time to kill like 1,000 of these enemies until I get my rep high enough.
Right, precisely. Anything I would assume anything grind based, right? In terms of like just having to do the thing over and over. Anything that gets in your way of doing that and repeating the grind would be frowned upon, right? We're not talking about the same thing in terms of like reflection as we were talking about earlier with the space that some of these games might require. And the WoW one's a little bit interesting because I feel like that can go both ways to an extent. Like I said, MMOs don't get too much more theme parky than WoW, particularly in the past few years, as it's become more and more linear with story, but or more and more story based. But I would say I think there are ways that like being able to there's a lot of different things to do in WoW. I would say I think a lot of the space where you would be thinking about that though wouldn't be in game. It would be like community based, right?
Yeah. Well, that's what strikes me as like in an MMO you can always reach out to somebody if you're like trying to think through what do I do next. There's hundreds or maybe thousands of people who are more experienced than you that you can just ask like, hey, I need to get like this particular route, where do I go? And that takes like 10 seconds. And like
exactly.
It's not something you need like a minute to like think about. But if you imagine yourself having the experience of playing WoW like by yourself and like trying to think of like how do I wrap my head around this massive world that I can engage with, you might actually really appreciate having some downtime.
Yeah. Yeah, so and like I think there's some level too of like as we're talking about the point of playing like Subnautica is like problem solving, right? It's survival. It's not just about like if you removed all of the reflective time or any of the limitations, which there is a mode that's basically just I forget what it's called, but it removes all your gauges. Basically, you have unlimited air, food, and water, and then it turns into a very different game, right? It's not about there's no problem solving to it, right? Like the function of the game is like creativity and like some puzzling and like figuring out how to utilize limited resources. WoW is that, right? WoW is far more kind of playing into this fantasy. This very large kind of being part of something bigger than yourself, being able to be a part of these big, huge, epic things, and having some agency in this gigantic world. And a lot of people play WoW in large part because they fell in love with Warcraft before WoW, So it's far more about like the setting and that sort of thing than these problem solving things, and hence having those times and spaces built into the game the way we were talking about earlier. Where, like I was complimenting the way that it's kind of very organic, that the air forced you to begin thinking about things, Subnautica, or going back to base for Metal Gear Solid before you go out to your next big thing. It doesn't really need those things, in fact, because you're right that there's no semblance that doesn't really kind of play into the core experience of what playing WoW is.
Right.
In large part, I think nowadays, and I think there's other a little bit less true, and it's a bit more difficult, but
there's no like deeper reason for the downtime too. Like in Subnautica, you don't just surface a lot because you have to, right? Like in WoW, you like have to get on these flying mounts because like you literally have to travel a long distance and it's quicker on a mount, but it still takes a second. But like in Subnautica, you're given an explanation in the game for why you need to surface or why you need to get water. Like you're given the explanation is that like you're a human and you need air and you need water. Like and as a player, you buy into that, and so it doesn't feel as like completely ridiculous that you're having to do those things. Whereas in WoW, like you're so untethered from like bodily realities anyway. Like you don't need food and water. Like you basically just have to worry about your health and magic, and like that. Obviously, food and water exist, but like you are mostly engaging with the theme park of it. Yeah. And it seems kind of arbitrary to be like everything that you normally are restricted and constrained by in this world is gone, except for you can't travel, as quickly as you'd like, and that does feel kind of arbitrary.
Yeah, sure, and that's the reason that people feel probably a little bit less excited about it. And of course, they've come up with ways to get around that in terms of teleporting at certain levels, and removing. And particularly, like I said, that's like endgame, where it doesn't really matter about seeing. There's a part of the game which is like seeing the world and the exploration part of it when you're first questing. But towards the end of the game, when you've seen everything, you don't really care about it anymore, and you just want to do the thing. Then you can kind of bypass that with these higher level things in terms of like portals or summons and all that jazz. So I think that lines up pretty nicely, actually, and that makes sense in terms of why there's certain places, and just kind of that question of like why it seems to, outside of just kind of the cultural standpoint, like I was talking about, kind of that constant go mentality. But why that is actually does work in some areas better than others, and Stardew and Subnautica and even MGS5, I think, to an extent, all definitely benefit from not playing into that mindset and actually giving those spaces.
Well, I think that's a good place for us to end, and it's a good summary of this episode. So we are actually, speaking of cycles, going to be ending Season 1 of Gaming Mechanics. And we would like to thank you all so much for joining us for the last 46 episodes. We realize that this is an atypical cycle, like it was over a year, and that's not normal for people to have recording cycles that have that long of a time period. And we're still sort of playing with how this is going to go in the future. But we'll be back for a Season 2 to record some more episodes. And we just wanted to take a moment to say thank you for joining us for all of our discussions and for being a part of this podcast.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, it's been an absolute blast. It'll be a lot of fun. Part of the reason we're taking the time off is I think partially for our own sanity, but also for Mark's wedding and moving. And so when we put up again, he'll be here. We'll be in the same area, and we'll get to do stuff together, and hopefully do some more live stuff. Actually, play games instead of just talking about them. I mean, we are mostly a podcast and analysis, but it'd be awesome to get to stream more. I think it's a goal that both of us would really love to do.
Yeah.
And it's in large part been done for we do this because we love it, really straight up, and so getting to see other people come along and be has been super gratifying. So thank you for joining us, and I hope that you enjoy the remainder of your summer. And this is looking forward to the next 46.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter @GamingMechanics or Facebook by going to facebook.com/GamingMechanics. Thanks for listening.